Welcome to Hashknife Hangouts. I'm Calen Carpenter. With me is my partner, co-host, and father, Brandon. Before we get started, though, for those of you on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. If you are on YouTube, you can shut off the notification bell if you would like, because we know we can be annoying. So if you really don't want to, don't put your notification on. But moving on, for Facebook, like, comment, and share, and then of course on all platforms, please spread the word to your friends. Now to the opening notes. So
Maybe they want to spread it to their enemies too.
well, yeah. I mean, hey, we might get a bigger following because people might hate us more.
There you
Uh,
go.
until
Sorry.
now, I've tried to keep from preparing opening comments, and I talked to Dad about this week, but I think it helps keep us focused on our discussion, and it provides a good intro for you guys, the viewer, if you decide to if this episode is actually worth your time or not. So, going with that, it also helps give me more airtime since Dad seems to talk a lot, and I tend to say a lot of yeps, yeahs, uh-huhs, and agreeds throughout our conversations. Maybe it's my vanity coming out, but I tend to be really critical of how we do things. And since we are a duo, ensuring we both talk is kind of important. Going forward, I think I will continue to do this with some short prepared intros, but not as long as last week because in order to one provide context and two be responsible in producing information and the opinions we provide, I want to make sure things are well thought out and kind of set up for us. So for this week, I'll start with this. Farmers and ranchers have a unique relationship with wildlife. I saw a commercial from one of our business partners this week where they promoted the preservation of wild horses in conjunction with the healing and therapy of veterans with PTS. So keep in mind, I say PTS, and a lot of veterans and military people will say PTS. It's not PTSD because the trauma and the horrors that a lot of people go through in war, that's not a disorder, that's a human function. So to be stressed and have that issue, that's a reason why it's a stress and not a disorder. That's completely natural for your body to want to reject those things. So healing with horses, with those roundups, the point of the commercial was the horses get traumatic stress from the roundups, and we'll talk about reasons why, and then the veterans do as well from their experience in combat and whatnot, and that's why they want to bring those together. So that was the context of this particular organization that was being promoted. Now the commercial did not promote a specific solution to what it was providing, but it alluded to like the promotion of anti-roundup and anti-slaughter campaigns, and the anti-roundups were illustrated as an important feature to the programs because it kept ranchers from forcing their way onto public lands for their own livestock herds, which, mind you, was not specifically stated, but it was kind of summarized by me. It's definitely something that somebody was alluding to as like the spokesperson on this commercial. So it made me think a lot of like how we interact with wildlife in general. We have complained a lot about predators, and I guarantee that won't stop. But today, what I would like to discuss is how we live with the wildlife, specifically deer, antelope, coyotes, not coyotes, birds, occasional mountain lions, and wolves. And then, of course, the animals common to our ranch, but maybe not others. So we'll kind of look at what we deal with on a regular basis compared to what other ranches may deal with. And then as well, not the common animals like the elk, moose, and bear, kind of like what I was talking about. And then of course wild or feral horses, and Dad will explain that a little bit as well because we did talk about that. Uh, Mainly because we're not going anywhere, and neither are they. So we got to figure out how to work with each other and live with each other, and still kind of keep that symbiotic relationship going. Each animal has its own place in our ecosystem, and it deserves to be part of the process. That I'll never take away, and I know Dad won't either. But the thought process of mine that started with the wild horses, I'll stick with that for now. So I'm not completely against wild horses, but I think we need to manage them just like any other animal we do, like deer, elk, moose, antelope, and etc. And then to kind of throw that out there, I did do a tweet earlier this week saying just that, and I actually got a lot of. Granted, it's from the agriculture community. I got a lot of positive feedback with that, and they're like, "Absolutely, we agree," because they feel the same way. It's not just the ground because we could use it for livestock and whatnot, but it's the ground because horses as an animal are hard on the ground, and we've discussed that before in some of our in the shoot episodes. So that's something to really keep in mind. It's a lot about preserving the ecosystem, not just trying to push animals out so that ranchers and agricultural industries can come in. I think part of that is because we've mythicized the horse to such an extent that we've stopped looking at them as wildlife, because that's what they are right now for those that are feral. And we continue to look at them as if they're our own pets out of our corrals and our pastures. So that did happen. That did happen in the Dust Bowl, where some of those animals did come out of their own pastures and whatnot, and that was for extenuating circumstances because people couldn't make payments and they couldn't take care of animals, so they released them. And you'll see traces of that in the Pryor Mountain herds in south central Montana. But moving on, if we don't manage the ground properly, and we don't take the animals into account, then what are we doing? So with that, today we'll kind of go over Mustang Roundups, the good, the bad, and the ugly with those, our impact and relationship with specifically the stuff that we see on our ranch: deer, antelope, and birds. The nuisance animals we talked about, like prairie dogs, badgers, weasels, and maybe some wolverines, which we don't really see those, but they are in the area. And then some other animals like elk, moose, bear that are not so common. And then and potentially talk about predators. So with that, what's your take, Dad?
My take is that I had incredible restraint letting you talk for like 3 minutes straight without replying.
See, so the prepared
So
comments are already working.
yeah, they are beautiful. It didn't mean I didn't have some facial expressions there to punctuate.
Yeah.
There's I think when you said mythicize horses, I think that's a really good word, because there are many, many people in our culture, most people know what the hell a horse is.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I was just asked this, I had a or not a magazine, a newspaper interview last week.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the guys come out the ranch and wanted to know what we're doing with the horses. I think I think it was Suzanne, the Dunroven Ranch, mentioned what we do with the teletraining portion of our collaboration with them. And so they wanted to get our take on it, because we're 400 miles away training a horse over the internet. I mean,
Right.
it's been a
It's a
hard thing
unique
to do.
situation.
Yeah, and we're working with Ashley Chapin. We had her on here a couple weeks ago in a 2-part series, but everybody knows what a horse is. And what, to me, they said, well, why is it that, what is it about a horse? And I said, well, they, to me, embody a wild, powerful, uh, just being, and something outside of humans that we have been able to capture, conquer, and use. But there's still that freedom. I mean, look what we do on some of our vehicles. You got a Ford Mustang.
Yeah.
Was it Ferrari has a rearing horse? A lot of coats of arms
Mm-hmm.
from medieval ages have horses. In one form or another, usually standing, rearing, pawing at the air. So I think that's part of the mystique of it.
I think,
But
and to jump in real quick, I think, coming from my past relationship, she'd never been around a horse before. And when she got to come and visit our horses, if depending on the type of horse, because sometimes they don't have a really laid back
right,
disposition. But when she got to, kind of hang out with them for a little bit, the first thing she told me was, they're like giant dogs. I'm like, yeah, they are. And I think that's part of it too.
well, when the Plains Indian first saw a horse, their word for it was big dog, or
Elk dog, right?
elk dog.
Yeah.
So because that was all they had to compare it to. But a couple of the things that really is utilized, I think, and it sounds like this commercial. I didn't see the commercial, but I've seen things like this.
Right.
Um, is that you have proponents for wild horses. Horses are not wild on the North American continent. They were here back when all of the continents were one, is in Pangea,
Yeah. As a
split apart.
prehistoric small
They
animal.
were absolutely, and there's lots of variations of horse. And then the first, or the basically what verified that there was wild or horses here, early horse in a dinosaur or fossil record, was right here in the Pryor Mountains, just south of us in south central Montana, and it borders into Wyoming, was the confirmation and the finding of Hyracotherium, one of the early horses. And so they were here before the continents split. I mean, we're talking, eons and eons ago,
Right.
but they went extinct here on the North American, so what we now call North American continent. And then they were reintroduced by Cortez when he, come up into Central America and Mexico, and was, bopping around here looking for gold and riches for the state, basically, and reintroduced. They had a number of horses. What we talked about this, what was it, 1519? You said?
Yeah, they arrived in 1519 to Central America, and they brought with them 16 horses.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I think they brought one mare, and 15 stallions, if I remember correctly. And the reason being was they used the mare to intimidate the locals, and I'll get to that in a second. But then it was also for, if they're going to establish a colony, they could also begin to raise colts, and that way they could start to raise up their, essentially their tanks, their modern day tanks. Today we have tanks and armored carriers, but then it was war horses. So
But their first one wasn't for a breeding program; it was for a conquering program, because you're not going to
right.
populate with one mare and
No,
and 15 stallions. So, but yeah,
right. But the intent there was, she would be the initial breeding stock to
yep.
help increase their, their stock over time, if it was available. But
And obviously they were all rideable, handleable. I mean, they were
I mean, for
using
the
them as a war
soldiers,
horse.
yeah,
Yeah,
I was gonna
exactly.
say, you look at a dog and a war dog, it's the same thing as a horse and a war horse. Completely different animals. You have to treat them as such.
Absolutely. They're a tool, they're a utility. So my point to this is Cortez brought these horses in. They had a breeding program. And I believe the Pueblo Indians, Mexican down in Mexico, they couldn't, for 200 years or 150 years, um, could not even touch a horse, the natives. So they had the Pueblo Rebellion, that come in later on, and they knew how to handle horses because they had watched. And when that rebellion took place, they took control of horses and they wiped out the Spanish, and because they'd been persecuted and
Right.
enslaved for generations. And after that, the use of the horse exploded, and they came north, and that's when the Plains Indians, first got into touch with them, and then absolutely used them. I mean, they were a game changer for whoever had them. I mean, imagine, because Indians fought each other. This was not one big happy Western prairie type of society. I mean, they enslaved each other's tribes or tribesmen when they went to war with them or invaded them. Back and forth. It was a competition for food and place.
Well, it's
And
a
these
lot like,
horses,
if you're familiar with the any of the, like, the Roman history, the Romans versus the Gauls, or
right,
the Franks, that type of mentality. It's very much like that, just in North America amongst Native American tribes.
sure, it's human nature, really. I mean, at its most common denominator,
Yeah.
just more and more or less sophisticated tools at the time. But when Plains Indians got a hold of a horse, holy crap! It was a game changer for them, literally. And they could expand their areas of, to get food, because they were, you know, nomadic. They were hunter gatherers and followed herds, followed the game, which most of the game was then plains animals, even elk, bear. They were all down here on the plains. They weren't in the mountains.
And more efficient for buffalo hunting as well, because before that time, people forget, buffalo hunting consisted of running them off of a cliff, and then you take what was left there, and there's a lot of waste to that.
Sure.
Whereas now, all they have to do is shoot. They run up to a buffalo herd and they run with it and they shoot it with arrows or they throw a lance through it. It's far more efficient and less wasteful.
And then as time progressed and they got firearms, then they use that too, an even more efficient way to hunt and kill. So
Yeah.
anyway, the whole thing about a horse being wild, because then horses got away from them. And horses are a herd animal and they will herd up. Um, when Lewis and Clark came through, there in the journals, it talks about them getting horses stolen right here along the Yellowstone on the return trip when Clark was coming down the Yellowstone, and Lewis had went back at Three Forks of the Missouri and decided to go up and explore the Marias River a little bit more, and then they met back down on the Missouri. Clark had his half of the expedition had a bunch of horses stolen right in this area, and they weren't stolen. I mean, these were horses that had been given to them by the Shoshone to get over the pass on the way out, and because Sacagawea was a Shoshone, her brother at the time when she come back, she'd been enslaved by the Mandans, and when she made her way back with Charbonneau and the Corps of Discovery, she was the one who negotiated getting horses so they could get over the pass and get over to the Columbia, and then spent that winter there and then come back. They had the horses. They still had these horses, and a lot of them were captured. Indians don't steal horses; they capture horses. I mean, that's just a cultural thing. I mean, so what? Okay, those horses weren't always kept. So you had horses that were turned loose. They were mixed. Um, you fast forward another 100 years, 130 years, and 150 years, and you've got the settling of the West out here, and then the uh, entire program that Lincoln started after, during right after the Civil War, kind of at the end of the Civil War, for the Homestead Act. A lot of people went broke, and some of them literally they turned their animals loose. They couldn't
Right.
sell them, couldn't get rid of them. They just turned them loose, so you see some of these quote unquote wild horses, direct descendants of Cortez. Yeah, no,
Most of
there's
them
some
aren't.
blood there, but there's also a lot of draft influence. You can see
Yep.
some draft influence on some of these horses, there's some people that will. I mean, they get emotional and pissed when you bring up that these are not a purebred herd, because they want you to believe that this is the last purebred herd from when Cortez brought these horses in. It's like, no, they've interbred, they've intermixed. Some of these horses have lots of different breed influences in them. So that is a feral horse, not a wild horse. There's a big difference. It's like you having a house cat, and all of a sudden one of these cats has kittens. You can't catch the kittens. The kittens go out and they learn to hunt like their mother told them. She is a domestic cat. These kittens, and if you ever had a barn cat or any cat, if you don't handle those cats, they are wild,
Oh yeah.
crazy wild. Doesn't mean they come from the wild as you would expect a mountain lion or a bobcat. They are feral, and that's the definition. Is it's something that has been domesticated that goes back into a wild ecosystem and survives as a wild animal, but it is not wild. It was once domesticated. That's the same situation we have with the horses. However, that doesn't sell well when you're trying to bring up your cause to, bring in some money or bring in some support for something. And to me, working with soldiers with uh, PST is kind of the new wave of, okay, they did the same thing with working with prisoners
Oh
and
yeah.
these and the horses. So it's just another way that kind of got its little limelight, and it worked for a bit, and I've got no argument with it. If it'll help somebody to work with a horse, great. If it helps to prevent some recidivism with a prisoner, and they can get their head straight, whatever the issue is, drugs, it's irrelevant. If that helps them to work through that and they become a productive member of society, fantastic. That's what that's about, right? If you can take a soldier who's sacrificed a lot of their life, and it helps them to recover and try to make them as whole as they can or functioning as they can in a a different world than they left, fantastic. But what I have issue with, it's almost like they're using the prisoners programs, are using the veterans as a tool to market their, really it's a cultural agenda, and
Right.
that pisses me off. I mean, that is
Well,
like, if you leave it there for what it is, you can do the same thing with any horse. It doesn't have to be a BLM captured feral horse. It can be any horse that does this, because they all think differently now.
hmm
When you have the trauma, they call it, and it is, and there's no doubt, when these animals are herded up, sure, they're scared like any other animal would be, and they're put into a corral, and they're taken in, then yes, it's going to cause an emotional response. And that's exactly how I've said we train, is through either an emotional response, which is sometimes difficult to do to get a positive emotional response. It's much easier to get a negative emotional response.
right.
But over time, that goes away. It doesn't mean these animals are completely damaged, because I've trained some Mustangs, you know that,
Yeah.
and some of them have been phenomenal horses and that weren't that tough to train. Others, oh yeah, a little bit different to bond with, not horribly different, just took a little bit longer. Okay, big deal. It was really not really much of an issue. And some of these horses, quite frankly, were really good horses at the end. But they're like any other horse. It's all about how they're handled, how they continue to have that relationship with, whether it's a prisoner, uh, a soldier, or somebody who just wants a ranch horse. And that's a cheap, very cheap way to get one. So that's kind of my spiel on how it's being used and marketed. And that bothers me a little bit. There's some misnomer about what a quote unquote wild horse is. It's a feral horse. So,
Yeah. Well,
but
and to go with your part of the way it's been, I guess, marketed, really is, I think you're probably 90% right, because there's probably that 10% that, no, we think this is how it should work out because it makes sense. I'm like, yeah, of course. But
mm,
I agree. I think probably a lot of that does come with, we have this availability to really sell ourselves because we're doing good for both parties. And then, of course, going towards what we talked about earlier, the good, the bad, and ugly in terms of like slaughter and stuff. We've mythicized this horse or this creature to a point where it's our puppy. We can't just kill our puppy. Well, okay, I'm going to tell you right now, culturally there are people, there are types of people that enjoy horse meat. Whether you
mm,
like that or not, they enjoy horse meat. I've never personally tried it. I'm open to try it because I've heard it's lean and it's actually pretty good. But you can't do that in America because we've shut down all the slaughters, and but we're not able to hunt these animals either. So, what's the only way we can manage these herds to help preserve the ecosystem and the ground, not just for livestock and agriculture, but for just the planet in general, just like we do for places like the park and I say park, the Yellowstone Park and the greater area around it. We manage the animal herds like the deer, the elk, the to an extent we're doing buffalo now, but moose and whatnot. But we don't do that for horses, and we need to. Whether that's going to be roundups and take them to slaughter, and or roundups and sell them to people who want them as their own animal, or straight hunting. And I don't know what the process would be for hunting, but to me it would make sense that you could roll them up into the fish, wildlife, and parks just like any other wild animal, and then it would be just another part of the tagging system and whatnot. But I don't think as a culture we would ever do that because people don't want to shoot a horse.
yeah, no, culturally that's just not what we do. And I mean, there are cultures that use horses as meat. Just like you said, the French love their horse.
Well, and I think Mongols
You
do
know,
too, don't they?
they do, well, absolutely. The Mongols, that is their mainstay.
Right,
That is how they live. They live off of mare's milk. They live off of young colts. They even their drink is fermented mare's milk.
right.
So
It hasn't changed much for the past couple thousand years for them.
no, it works for them. And
Yeah.
have you ever seen Mongolia? I've only seen pictures, but man, that's some rough looking country. Those 29-year-old people look like they're 70.
Well, it's also that's a giant desert. I
It's
didn't
a
realize
huge
it
desert.
until I was doing some research in Afghanistan, and somebody's like, "Yeah, you didn't know that? It's a giant desert." I'm like, "What?" And you look at it, and the desert's legitimately like 300 miles by 600 miles.
Right. Well, and it's cold.
Yeah,
I mean, it's that is they are hardy people. So, they take care of their horses, but their horses are a very big part of their survival. If they don't have them, they probably wouldn't last long. Within a couple of generations would probably be an extinct group of people. Um, when you talk about the mystique of the horse and how they're used and how they're presented in this commercial, it almost, and of course we look for it, so we're probably a little bit biased about, okay, where are they trying to stick a fork in us at,
well, and I
and that
wouldn't
is,
even say we're looking for it. It's just we've been around it enough that we're familiar with it that I notice things before others might.
yeah, there's an awareness there, I guess you
Yeah,
could say. That's a good way to, it's probably a more fair way to put it. But there's also an agenda behind that. It's like it's an anti-ranching. These
right,
evil ranchers are trying to take the land and displace these beautiful animals, and while they're doing it, they're traumatizing them. So we have to do
right.
something with these horses, and this is the good that we can do. That's the whole sell of it. So when you hear that, and and you hear, oh, they just want to put more areas for their evil ranching and displace these animals for pure profit. They're
Right.
making millions off of this, off of your, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, all of these different lands that are set aside that are multiple use, and there are grazing permits. You just don't take your cows out and dump them on a piece of property without some kind of, retribution, or certainly, I'm not saying it's causal and necessarily unjustified, because I think we just did a short deal on some of the issues with Clive Bundy down in the BLM grounds in Nevada.
Right.
So there, it's not without its issue, and there's not anybody's 100% right on that as well. But we are not greedy. I mean, if you don't sustain the land, you don't sustain anything. So I mean, ranchers are some of the biggest ecologists, if you want to call that. And ecologists have a not the greatest name, and I think it's a marketing, because they've over marketed. The science behind ecology has been hijacked once again by environmentalists, not ecologists.
Well, and that's another to the point I think that you're making, and to build off of what we spoke about for last week, that there many times environmentalists or those who are huge proponents of, you know, climate, trying to take care of the climate because there's this climate change, whether you agree with it or not, but there's things happening in the world that we are trying to like minimize carbon footprints and whatnot. And then we look at ranchers and farmers and we say, you're the reason why we have this issue with ozone layers because cows are farting and stuff like that. That was last week's episode. If you want to look at, go check it out. But what my point is exactly what you just said. The farmers and ranchers are trying to take care of the land because, again, I've said this last week, the land takes care of us. We take care of the land because the land takes care of us. And to say that we don't care about the land is just, it's a complete misnomer. And so that's going to your point. We have to make sure that we're not just looking at this as ground that we can take and we can reap the benefits from. It's, hey, you guys are just as invested in this planet as we are. Like, we're on the same page with trying to take care of the ground, because if we don't take care of that ground, it's going to fall apart and it will not be productive and it won't help with, plant growth or anything like that. But you have to remove some of these animals, otherwise that's not going to happen. And there's a hypocritical side to the other side of the argument here, that, oh, we have to save all these animals, they need to stay where they are at. Yeah, but you're not looking at the whole picture. You're only looking at one specific piece, but then you're turning around and out the other side of your mouth you're saying we have to take care of the earth. You're not doing that with what you're doing right now. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't mesh up. And so that's where I think a lot of the frustration on our end comes in, because we get attacked for things like that. But then because there's a, I don't know, a purpose or this niceness behind this mentality of I'm going to try and save these horses. It legitimizes their reason to completely disregard what they were arguing about before that conversation. I'm like, you got to look at all the context. You can't just pick and choose.
Well, and it's still the same. It's the same thing that was happening back in my former life as a state game warden. They talked about anti-hunting at that time,
Yeah,
and how the anti-hunting movement was what were the demographics of that, and the demographics at the time, and I don't think it's changed a whole lot. Um, over the last, that was end of that was or 30 years ago, 25 to 30 years ago, right in the middle of that career, but 10% of the population hunted nationwide. 10% were anti-hunting, absolutely against it. That were hunters were murderers, and the hunter said, well, these people are wackos. 80% of the population had no stake in it, nothing to lose or gain over it. But the the game plan for those 10% that were anti-hunting was to target that 80% so that they had a loud voice and guess what it's all boiled down to? Cash.
yeah,
And I think at the time that the most of those who were supporting that anti-hunting, that were not part of actively doing it, but were sending cash, were they were marketing like 22 years old to, that was like 38 years old, single women, and they had nothing else, in their lives. They weren't involved with their own kids. They had expendable income, and they were easily, um, say manipulated, but easily led through emotion. And that was their base to try to siphon money. So part of the problem is that 10%, if those numbers are the same, and I don't know that they are on this kind of issue, but just saying if they were, that 10% um, really has no stake in, even though they're wildly opposed to it, they have no stake in what's going on the land other than through their computer,
right. Well, they
because
don't.
this is
I
what they
don't think
believe in.
they. That's the other problem too, and it comes with a lot of issues with wildlife, like wolves and bears is another one right now, and then bison, because bison's another one that's been mythicized. Um,
Mhm.
the There's a part of the argument that is understood, and it's probably, I think you're right. The other side pulls emotional argument, and that's how they're able to get the other 80% or whatever. But because people don't live in the area, they don't have the context of the situation. Again, understanding the impact of the ground, the impact with livestock, the impact with people. There's the great notion is, hey, we're gonna bring back this buffalo herd like there was to millions, like there used to be, 150 years ago. Okay, that's cool, but where are they gonna go? Because people can always just say that, and it's like we've talked about with the cattle. Just because I can put 400 head on a pasture does not mean I'm going to do it, because what happens with that 400 head after a season? It completely wipes out the ground. So we can do a million of buffalo across the United States, but where are they going to go? Because they're going to be in your they're going to be in your backyard. They're going to be in somebody else's backyard. They're going to be all over the place, and there's no place for them to go. They're going to end up becoming a nuisance, and not only that, the ground
And
will be
dangerous.
destroyed and dangerous,
Right.
but the ground will be destroyed. And then what's the effect of that? And here's where you start looking down the road, because people aren't doing that. You're going to have a million buffalo, and it's going to be beautiful for a year, and then the next year they won't have any food, and they'll die because they will literally starve to death.
Right. No, that's exactly right. That reminds me of a couple of things, a couple of issues come up there about the lack of understanding of, say, what carrying capacity is.
Right.
And there was some conflict down just a little bit east of here when I was a warden in part of my district about how many elk were allowed to be hunted in a certain area that was almost entirely outside of some state sections and very, very little BLM. It was mostly private land. And some people liked the elk. Those who didn't have them on their place and wanted to hunt them liked them.
Yep.
those who had them on their place and had haystacks getting eaten, crops destroyed, fences getting tore up. I mean, as a constant churn, not just it would happen and then it went away. It was all the time. And there was a gal there I can remember, and she apparently had just learned about carrying capacity or the term,
Mm-hmm.
and she had land there and she liked the elk, but she had no crops. She had absolutely no stake in income off of the property. She had a very small piece of property that the elk maybe would run across. She would go to these meetings and she would not let go of, you need to have, we need to know what the carrying capacity of this ground is out here, and then that you can determine if that's the carrying capacity, then that's how many elk you have. And you're like, well, what about the cows? It doesn't matter, it's the carrying capacity for the elk. I mean, she would not, you couldn't get it through her head. The carrying capacity is per animal, and each one of those happened to be a little different for whatever species it is. But I mean, she was wanting this, the carrying capacity she came up with. I mean, it was like you say, turning a herd of buffalo loose, and it's like there's going to be elk everywhere. I mean, there's sustainability and tolerability with the ground itself. Then there's also some social uh, carrying capacity, if you want to call it that, where how much will people put up with this many animals? And you can't believe the calls I used to get for people in a metro area around Billings that would just throw a fit because deer were eating their flowers in their flower bed.
Oh yeah. You can't do
That
anything about
is
that.
that no, it's that there's some intolerance, a social intolerance. I mean, because they're eating their petunias and they are thinking I need to come and swoop in there and remove these animals. Like, no,
It's not
that's
how
not
it
going to
works.
happen. So
No.
so you have all of these different interests based on what their tolerance is. So um, the horses are the hardest animal on the ground. We've talked about that, just as you said. So we're not trying to just displace them with more of our own horses. That's not happening either. So there's a real educational thing that needs to be taken into account again. And unless you've lived that, and there are some people who, if there's an antelope near their place, they want it dead. I mean, that isn't realistic either, and they think that that antelope is eating more grass than their cow can eat, and it's not. Yeah, is it competing? Of course it is.
Right.
However, it ain't eating hay. Antelope don't eat haystacks. Deer eat the hell out of haystacks.
And
Elk eat
elk. Yeah.
haystacks, but antelope do not eat on haystacks. In the wintertime, they browse on sagebrush. And you don't have cows chewing on sagebrush unless you don't have enough grass. And if you don't, you've got either drought conditions, bad grasshoppers that have eaten everything, or too many cows,
Right. And I think
right?
that
So,
that's a great way to go into, like, as a segue into the impact of wildlife, because like you said, deer, elk primarily, they do become a nuisance to an extent with haystacks, because you have to either fence it off, or you have to allow hunters to come onto your place in order to uh, minimize, yeah, I guess reduce the numbers of the herd. But then again, it's not going to make the herd go away, but you have to try and deal with, okay, how do I fence these guys out? You don't always get to do that. Even the tallest elk fence isn't going to keep elk out forever. And then same with like antelope and whatnot, they just go through fences. But like, I guess what's your take on that, especially being a former game warden where you've had to try and haze stuff away from?
well, not only haze things, but go out there at night when they come into somebody's cornfield
Uh,
who is, they're trying to harvest corn and make, some feed for their operation. And these elk are chewing on corn and doing quite nicely on it.
yeah,
They're they're having some of their harvested corn that is outside of a granary. Their granary's full enough, and they've got it laying on the ground and covered. And the elk are eating right off the pile of corn, and it's like, yeah, that's kind of a problem. Um, the issue there is now, what do you do about it?
right,
And elk, deer, they're smart animals. They're way smarter than people give them credit for. So you have a couple of options. You can outright kill them, which we've done. You know, you go in and you harvest some of them out of there. It does a couple of things. It'll reduce the numbers if you can kill the cows. And it sounds counterintuitive where you control a population by taking the females out because they probably have one calf in them or
Mm.
the potential to make a calf is what I should really say. And you know, you're not gonna kill all of the males. They're a little more wily, and one bull elk or one deer can breed how many animals in a breeding season? 50, 80, who knows? You know, I mean, they are voracious breeders because that's what their species calls for in a early fall to late fall, depending on what their gestation and their life cycle is. But you can kill some of those animals, and at the same time, it puts pressure on these animals to leave.
Right.
And that's what it's about. It's about at least hazing them away and getting them off of the property that is, you know, causing all the destruction. So dirt turners have a problem too. You know, it isn't just wheat; it's wheat fields as well as corn, um, beet fields. I never had that much of an issue with the beet field. I really like the corn, but still, it tears it up. You know, I heard a elk going across a beet field down on the riparian area on a young plants, yeah, it's gonna kill some of those plants, or at least certainly stunt the growth a little bit. So your yield goes down. I mean, you can feel for these guys, and we're not dirt turners. I wouldn't be the first one to tell you I know anything about harvesting, growing and harvesting beets because I don't. I mean, you know, we live around it, but that's not what we do.
Right.
So that is still an impact for them. It isn't just grass that is a perennial. These are annual crops, and so hazing, increased numbers for hunting. All of those things are tools to manage.
Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Hashknife Hangouts. We will continue discussing our relationship with wildlife next week. Until then, thanks until you're better paid.